The morning of February 25, 1945, began like most mornings over the English countryside. Cold, gray, the kind of damp that worked its way through a flight jacket and settled into the bones before the sun had even decided whether it was worth the effort of rising. At Steeple Morden, the home of the 355th Fighter Group, mechanics were already out on the hardstands, pulling covers off engines, running through pre-flight checks on the long, tapering noses of their P-51 Mustangs. Lieutenant Charles Chuck Yeager, had he been there, would have recognized the smell immediately: oil, high-octane fuel, a faint trace of hydraulic fluid. But this story belongs to a different man. A man whose name you almost certainly have never heard, even though what he did that morning above the overcast skies of central Germany should have made him famous the moment his wheels touched down. His name was Lieutenant William Bill Overstreet, Jr. He was 23 years old. He was from Clifton Forge, Virginia, and in approximately 4 hours, he would find himself alone in the sky over occupied France, throttle pushed to the firewall, his single Mustang weaving between the girders of the Eiffel Tower at 300 miles per hour, chasing a German Messerschmitt 109 that had no idea it could not escape. But to understand how he got there, you have to understand the world that put him in that cockpit. If you are new to this channel, welcome. Stories like this one are exactly why we are here. Subscribe now so you never miss another one. These are the men and the machines that the history books tend to leave out. By the beginning of 1945, the strategic air campaign over Europe had been running for nearly 2 years at full intensity. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases across southern England, was sending hundreds of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators deep into German-held territory every single week. Their targets were the industrial heart of the Third Reich: oil refineries, aircraft factories, rail marshalling yards, synthetic rubber plants. The logic was straightforward: destroy the machinery of German war production, and the Wehrmacht starves. Destroy the fuel supply, and the Luftwaffe dies on the ground. It was a reasonable theory. The problem was the cost of proving it. In the early years of the bombing campaign, American planners had believed their heavy bombers could protect themselves. The B-17 was bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, 13 of them on the later models, covering virtually every angle of approach. Crews called it the Flying Fortress for a reason. Military doctrine held that tight formation flying would create overlapping fields of fire that German fighters could not penetrate. That theory died over Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943. On that day, the 8th Air Force sent 290 B-17s to bomb the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt in Bavaria. Ball bearings were considered a critical bottleneck in German war production. Knock them out, and production of aircraft, tanks, and artillery pieces would grind to a halt. The mission planners knew it would be dangerous. They did not know it would be catastrophic. The American formations crossed into German-controlled airspace without fighter escort. The escort fighters of that era, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the early P-38 Lightning, lacked the range to accompany the bombers all the way to a target 350 miles inside enemy territory. They could fly with the bombers as far as the German border, perhaps slightly beyond, and then they had to turn back. After that, the bombers were on their own. What awaited them over Germany that day was the full weight of Luftwaffe fighter command. Gruppen of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s rose to meet the American formations in coordinated, relentless waves. The Germans had developed new tactics specifically designed to break up tight bomber formations. Head-on attacks at closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour, designed to reduce the pilot's reaction time to near zero. 60 B-17s were shot down. 5 more crashed on return and were written off. Another 121 sustained damage. 600 American airmen were killed, captured, or went missing. The ball-bearing factories were damaged, but they were back in production within weeks. The 8th Air Force was grounded for months while commanders reconsidered everything they thought they knew. The lesson was devastating in its clarity. Without fighter escort all the way to the target and back, the strategic bombing campaign was not sustainable. The question was whether a fighter with sufficient range actually existed. It did. It just had not yet been given the right engine. The North American P-51 Mustang had been designed in the extraordinary span of 117 days in 1940. The British Purchasing Commission had approached North American Aviation needing fighters quickly. North American, rather than building someone else's design under license, offered to create their own. The result was an airframe of remarkable aerodynamic refinement, low-drag laminar flow wings, a clean fuselage, and an enclosed radiator arrangement that generated minimal resistance. The problem was the engine. The early Mustangs came fitted with an Allison V1710 that performed adequately at low altitude but fell apart in thin air above 15,000 feet. It was fast on the deck and useful for tactical reconnaissance, but it could not follow German interceptors to the altitudes where the big bomber formations flew. Then, in the spring of 1942, a Royal Air Force test pilot named Ronald Harker flew an Allison-powered Mustang and had a thought. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the Lancaster bomber, and the de Havilland Mosquito, had a two-stage supercharger. At high altitude, that supercharger compressed the thin air and fed it to the engine at near sea-level density. Performance at 20,000 feet, 25,000 feet, 30,000 feet was extraordinary. What would happen, Harker wondered, if you put that engine into a Mustang airframe? The answer, as it turned out, would change the outcome of the air war over Europe. Rolls-Royce converted 5 Mustang airframes to take the Merlin engine. The results were staggering. The modified aircraft was faster than the Spitfire at every altitude above 15,000 feet. It was faster than the Focke-Wulf 190. It could outclimb the Messerschmitt 109E. And crucially, with drop tanks fitted beneath the wings, it had a combat radius that no other single-engine fighter in the world could match, roughly 850 miles in the P-51D configuration. That was enough to escort a bomber formation from England to Berlin and back. North American began producing the Merlin-powered Mustang in quantity as the P-51B and C, later refined into the definitive P-51D with its clear bubble canopy and 650 caliber wing guns. By the end of 1943, they were arriving in England. By the beginning of 1944, they were flying escort missions deep into Germany. By February of that year, during the week of missions that bomber crews would call Big Week, the Mustangs were ranging all the way to Berlin itself. General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, issued a directive that altered fighter tactics fundamentally. Rather than flying tight escort patterns around the bombers, a defensive posture that left the initiative entirely to the Germans, fighter pilots were now encouraged to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever they found it. The motto became, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighter is to destroy German fighters." The effect was immediate and cumulative. German pilots who had been flying since Spain, since Poland, since the Battle of Britain were being killed. New pilots coming out of compressed Luftwaffe training programs, sometimes with fewer than 100 flying hours, were being thrown into combat against men who had been living and breathing aerial combat for a year or more. The attrition was unsustainable. Into this world stepped Lieutenant Bill Overstreet. Overstreet had grown up in the Allegheny Mountains of Western Virginia, the son of a railroad worker. He had developed a mechanical aptitude early, spending his teenage years taking apart and reassembling anything with an engine. When the United States entered the war following Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Overstreet was 19 years old and eager to fly. He enlisted, passed the Army Air Force's aviation cadet examination, and began the long pipeline of primary, basic, and advanced flight training that would eventually put him in the cockpit of a Mustang. He arrived in England in the late months of 1944, assigned to the 363rd Fighter Squadron, part of the 357th Fighter Group based at Leiston in Suffolk. The 357th was already one of the most decorated fighter groups in the 8th Air Force. Its pilots called themselves the Yoxford Boys, after the nearby village. By the time Overstreet joined them, they had been in combat for nearly a year and had built a reputation for aggressive, skilled fighting. The group had been the first in the 8th Air Force to transition entirely to the P-51 Mustang. It had been one of the first to escort bombers to Berlin. Its pilots had destroyed more enemy aircraft than almost any other group in the theater. This was the culture Overstreet joined, competitive, serious, suffused with the particular pride of men who knew their aircraft were the best fighters in the sky. His early missions followed the established pattern. Escort duty. The bombers assembled in their vast formations over the English countryside, hundreds of aircraft climbing through the overcast in a precisely choreographed sequence that required nerves of steel and total instrument proficiency. The fighters formed up around them. Then the whole armada turned east and headed for Germany. The work was less romantic than the public imagined. Most escort missions involved hours of monotonous formation flying, scanning the sky for threats that never materialized, burning fuel, absorbing cold through the cockpit walls. The heating system in early Mustangs was inadequate. At 25,000 feet, temperatures outside the aircraft could fall to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Pilots wore electrically heated suits, but the systems were unreliable. Frostbite was common. And then, sometimes without warning, the sky erupted. German controllers had become skilled at identifying the bomber stream's target from its course and altitude, then vectoring their interceptors to hit the formation at the most advantageous point. When the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs came, they came fast and they came in force. A pilot who was not paying attention when the sky changed from empty to full of tracer fire had approximately no margin for error. Overstreet paid attention. He was building the instincts that only came with experience, the ability to track multiple aircraft simultaneously, to calculate deflection angles in fractions of a second, to keep situational awareness of where he was relative to the bombers, the escort, and the German fighters all at the same time. He was becoming a combat pilot. What he could not yet know was that on a February morning above occupied France, those instincts would be tested in a way that no training could have prepared him for. The mission on February 25, 1945, was a large-scale strategic bombing raid. The specific target that day was part of the continuing campaign to destroy German oil production and transportation networks, the kind of target that would send hundreds of heavy bombers deep into the Reich with full fighter escort. The 357th was part of that escort. Overstreet was flying with his squadron, covering the bombers from above and behind, watching the horizon. During the mission, as so often happened in the chaotic airspace over Central Europe, squadrons became separated. Formation integrity broke down in cloud, or in the violent maneuvering of a combat engagement, or simply because one aircraft had an engine problem and turned back, pulling another with it as wingman. The organized geometry of the fighter escort could dissolve in minutes into scattered elements and lone aircraft trying to find their way back to the group. At some point during the return from the target, Overstreet found himself alone. His wingman was gone. His squadron was not visible. He was a single P-51D Mustang with a Merlin engine, several thousand rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and a long way to go to get back to England. This was the moment that the 8th Air Force's leadership feared most. A lone fighter, separated from his group, was vulnerable in ways that a formation was not. The recommended procedure was to turn for home immediately, at low altitude if possible to avoid radar detection, and get across the channel as quickly as the fuel situation allowed. There was no shame in it. The mathematics of aerial combat were unforgiving, and a single aircraft caught by a German patrol was a dead aircraft. Overstreet did not turn for home immediately. What he saw next made sure of that. Below him, at lower altitude, he spotted a Messerschmitt 109. The German pilot had apparently not seen the lone Mustang above. He was flying west, away from Germany, possibly also separated from his own formation, possibly running low on fuel. The details of what the German pilot was thinking will never be known. What is known is what Overstreet decided. He pushed the nose down and went after him. The Messerschmitt 109G, the variant most commonly encountered by American fighter pilots in the final year of the European Air War, was a formidable machine. It had been in continuous development since its first flight in 1935, and by 1945 it had been refined, strengthened, re-engined, and up-armed multiple times. The G model flew with a Daimler-Benz 605 engine producing roughly 1,400 horsepower. It carried a 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns mounted above the engine. Could climb at nearly 4,000 feet per minute. Its top speed at altitude was approximately 386 miles per hour. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was dangerous in ways that raw performance figures could not capture. American pilots had learned to respect the 109 without fearing it. The Mustang had advantages, better cockpit visibility in the D model, superior range, and a high-speed rolling ability that the 109 could not match. But the German aircraft could turn tighter at lower speeds, and its nose-mounted armament was devastatingly concentrated. A pilot who let a 109 get behind him and hold position for 2 seconds was in serious danger of not surviving the experience. Overstreet dove on the German aircraft from above. His Mustang accelerated in the dive, the Merlin engine building to a deep, characteristic howl as he closed the distance. The engagement was happening at relatively low altitude, well below the operating heights of the Escort mission. The terrain of northern France was passing beneath them. The specific geography of that territory was about to become critically important. The German pilot saw him coming. The 109 broke hard, the pilot pulling maximum G in an attempt to force the Mustang to overshoot or lose sight. Overstreet stayed with him. The two aircraft wheeled across the sky in the violent, close geometry of a turning fight. Each pilot was trying to get the angle that would allow a deflection shot, leading the target aircraft far enough that the gun burst would arrive at the same point in space as the enemy plane. Then the German made a decision that transformed the engagement from a standard aerial dogfight into something that would be talked about in squadron-ready rooms for years. He turned toward Paris. The city of Paris in February 1945 was still under German occupation, technically. But the liberation had come the previous August. Paris had been freed on August 25, 1944, almost exactly 6 months before this engagement. By February 1945, the city was firmly in Allied hands. It was, in aerial combat terms, contested airspace in the sense that German aircraft might still pass over it, but it was no longer defended by German anti-aircraft batteries in the way it had been during the occupation years. What the German pilot was counting on, or perhaps simply hoping, was that the presence of a large city and its civilian population might cause the American to break off the pursuit. It was a reasonable calculation. 8th Air Force rules of engagement regarding populated areas were serious. Pilots were expected to exercise judgment about the risk to civilian life. A dogfight over a major city, with the risk of a crashing aircraft striking populated areas, was exactly the kind of thing commanders wanted to avoid. Overstreet did not break off. The chase continued west and then south, dropping lower as the two aircraft maneuvered over the outskirts of the city. They were below rooftop level in places, racing between buildings with a closing speed on turns that left almost no margin for error. The air at low altitude in an urban environment is turbulent, disrupted by heat differentials from buildings, by the channeling effects of streets, by the invisible wakes of structures passing at high speed. Flying an aircraft at combat power this close to the ground required a kind of physical courage that was distinct from the courage required to fly at altitude. Up high, there was space to recover from a mistake. There was time, seconds, perhaps, but real seconds, to think. Down here, a control input applied half a heartbeat too late meant a building, a bridge, a river surface. The Seine was below them now. And there, directly ahead, the Eiffel Tower. The iron lattice structure, designed by Gustave Eiffel and erected in 1889 for the Paris Exposition, stood 984 feet tall at its tip, including the antenna added later. It occupied a specific stretch of the Champ de Mars on the left bank of the Seine, flanked by the Trocadero on the opposite bank. The four legs of the structure were set well apart at the base, and the arches between them created gaps of significant width, wide enough, as it turned out, for a P-51 Mustang traveling at approximately 300 miles per hour. The German pilot flew beneath the tower, threading his Messerschmitt through the open space beneath the arch. It was a maneuver designed either to test the Americans' nerve or to force a collision with the structure. Either way, it was a demonstration that the German pilot was genuinely skilled and genuinely desperate in equal measure. Overstreet followed him through. If you have ever stood beneath the Eiffel Tower and looked up at the latticed ironwork above you, you have a partial sense of the geometry of what happened next. The tower's first floor is at approximately 187 feet. The legs spread outward below that. At the speed of a diving Mustang, the visual processing required to thread that gap with wings level and nose tracking a target aircraft ahead was something that no amount of description fully communicates. He made it through. The German pilot, apparently realizing that the American behind him was not going to be shaken, made one final attempt to escape. The 109 pulled up and tried to use its climbing ability to extend the distance. At low speed and low altitude, The Messerschmitt could climb steeply in ways that would force a less experienced American pilot to stall his aircraft attempting to follow. Overstreet did not follow vertically. He tracked the climbing aircraft with his gun sight, and at the right moment, as the 109's climb bled away its airspeed, he fired. The 50 caliber guns in the Mustang's wings delivered a combined rate of fire of approximately 1,200 rounds per minute from 4 guns, 4 of the standard 6 having live ammunition on this particular configuration. The tracer line found the German aircraft. The Messerschmitt began to trail smoke. The pilot did not eject. The German ejection seat technology of the period, while it existed, was not universally fitted or reliable at the altitudes involved. The 109 went down. Overstreet was now low on fuel, low on ammunition, alone over Paris, and facing the long flight back to England across the Channel. He pointed north, climbed to altitude, and flew home. When he landed at Leiston and reported what had happened, the reaction in the squadron was precisely what you might expect from men who had spent months flying combat over Europe. There was disbelief first, followed by the slow recognition that Overstreet was not the type to exaggerate. There were questions, very specific questions about the approach angle, the gap clearance, the visibility through the structure, the angle at which the fire had connected with the German aircraft. There was also, almost certainly, the particular kind of dark humor that combat aviators develop as a psychological mechanism. Someone would have said something about the Eiffel Tower having seen a lot of things but nothing quite like that. Someone else would have pointed out that the French were probably not thrilled about the whole arrangement regardless of how it turned out. The official record was less colorful. The kill was logged. The circumstances were noted. Overstreet received credit for 1 enemy aircraft destroyed. The specifics of the Eiffel Tower did not make the official report in the way that might generate headlines. This was entirely typical of the 8th Air Force's relationship with its own extraordinary history. The volume of remarkable things that happened in the skies over Europe between 1942 and 1945 was so large that individual acts of astonishing skill and courage were routinely processed through the administrative machinery of a warfighting organization and filed away. There was always another mission tomorrow. There was always another briefing, another formation, another target. Now is the moment to pause and acknowledge something important about this story, and about the way it fits into the larger history of the air war over Europe. If you have been watching this channel for a while, you know that we are committed to presenting history accurately. The Eiffel Tower pursuit is documented, attributed to Bill Overstreet, and accepted by aviation historians and by the 357th Fighter Group Association. What we cannot tell you with certainty is every precise detail of what the pilots were thinking, the exact words spoken in the ready room that evening, or the German pilot's name or fate. Those records, if they exist at all, are not publicly available. What we can tell you is this. The engagement happened. The pilot was real. The tower was real. And the world that produced it, the specific combination of aircraft, training, doctrine, and circumstance that put a 23-year-old from Virginia in that position on that February morning, was the product of years of industrial, organizational, and human effort on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend today. To understand what the 357th Fighter Group represented in the winter of 1945, you have to understand what the American aviation industry had become by that point. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the country was producing approximately 3,000 military aircraft per year. President Franklin Roosevelt, recognizing that the war would be won or lost on the production lines as much as on the battlefield, set a target that his advisors privately considered insane: 50,000 aircraft in 1942 alone. The number was not met. The eventual production figure for 1942 was 47,800, followed by 86,000 in 1943 and 96,000 in 1944. To put that in context, Germany, at its peak in 1944, produced approximately 40,000 aircraft. Japan produced approximately 28,000. The United States alone outproduced both Axis powers combined. North American Aviation's factory in Inglewood, California, was at the center of this production miracle. The Mustang line ran at a pace of more than 100 aircraft per week during peak production. The workers on that line, many of them women who had entered the industrial workforce for the first time during the war, were working in 3 shifts around the clock. Every aircraft they built had to be perfect. The tolerance for error in a combat aircraft is essentially 0. Each P-51D that rolled off the Inglewood line cost the United States government approximately $51,000 in 1944 terms. The aircraft was equipped with a Packard-built Merlin engine. Rolls-Royce had licensed the design to Packard Motor Car Company, which produced the V1650 in its Detroit factory at a rate sufficient to meet both American and British demand. The Merlin developed approximately 1,490 horsepower at combat power setting in the D model. The aircraft carried 429 gallons of fuel internally, with provision for 2 additional drop tanks of 75 gallons each beneath the wings. The drop tanks would be released before combat. They were a fire hazard in a fight and created drag that reduced maneuverability. The internal fuel alone gave the Mustang a ferry range of over 1,400 miles. 6 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns were mounted in the wings, 3 per side. Each gun carried between 270 and 400 rounds, depending on configuration. The guns were harmonized to converge at a specific range, typically around 250 yards, creating a concentrated cone of fire at the point where the pilot wanted the burst to be most effective. The aircraft weighed roughly 10,100 pounds fully loaded. Its wingspan was 37 feet. Its length was 32 feet and 3 inches. From nose to tail, from the spinner of its 4-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller to the rudder, it was a machine of extraordinary refinement, the product of a design philosophy that prioritized aerodynamic efficiency above nearly everything else. In the winter of 1944 to 45, this machine was arguably the finest piston engine fighter in the world. It was faster than the Focke-Wulf 190 at most altitudes. It had greater range than anything the Luftwaffe could put in the sky. Its pilots, trained in a system that by that point had refined its curriculum through 3 years of combat experience, were among the most skilled in the world. And yet the war that these men were fighting was still deadly in ways that the statistics can only partially capture. The 8th Air Force's total losses between August 1942 and May 1945 numbered over 47,000 killed, with more than 28,000 taken prisoner. The strategic bombing campaign cost more American lives than any other single theater of operations in any service. Those numbers encompass the bomber crews and the fighter pilots alike. The fighter pilots died in several specific ways. They died in aerial combat, of course, a bullet through the cockpit, a cannon shell into the engine, a collision in the chaos of a turning fight. They died in accidents because the aircraft they flew were high-performance machines operating at the edge of their designed envelopes, and the men flying them were sometimes tired, sometimes cold, sometimes simply at the end of their concentration after 4 or 5 hours in a narrow cockpit at altitude. They died from mechanical failures, an oil line that parted, a coolant leak that the Merlin could not survive, a supercharger that failed at the wrong moment. And they died, sometimes, from the specific vulnerability of operating alone. The standard 8th Air Force tactical formation was built on the element of 2 aircraft, a lead and a wingman. The wingman's primary job was not to shoot Germans. It was to protect the leader's rear. The moment you were alone, you had no one watching behind you. Every German fighter pilot knew that the 6 o'clock position, directly behind and slightly below, was where kills came from. A pilot alone had to check his 6 constantly, and in a combat environment, constantly was never enough. This was the situation Bill Overstreet was in when he decided to pursue the German pilot instead of turning for home. He was accepting an elevated risk. He knew it. He did it anyway. There is a quality in certain combat pilots that instructors recognize early and never quite know how to teach. It is not bravery in the conventional sense. Most combat pilots will tell you they were frightened most of the time, that the absence of fear was not what made the difference. It is closer to a quality of decision-making that functions under stress without degrading. The ability to assess a rapidly changing situation, commit to a course of action, and execute it precisely even as the situation continues to change around you. Overstreet had it. The sequence of decisions he made in the engagement over Paris, to pursue, to follow through the tower, to use the trajectory of the climbing aircraft at the moment of minimum airspeed, was not a sequence that could have been taught in a classroom or practiced on a gunnery range. It was the result of the specific kind of experience that only comes from having been in a great many situations where the wrong decision had real consequences. He was, in this sense, exactly the pilot that the 8th Air Force's training system had been trying to produce since the beginning of the war. If the story is resonating with you, This is the perfect time to subscribe if you have not already. Histories like this one, the specific human-scale stories inside the massive machinery of the Second World War, are what this channel is built around. Hit that subscribe button and join the community. The months that followed Overstreet's February engagement were the final months of the European Air War. The Luftwaffe, which had been the most powerful air force in the world when it unleashed itself on Poland in September 1939, was dying. Not dramatically, not with a single climactic battle, but through the grinding cumulative mathematics of attrition. German pilot training, which had been world-class in the early years of the war, had been compressed as the need for replacements outpaced the instructors available. By 1944, some Luftwaffe pilots were being sent into combat with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. American pilots typically arrived in operational units with 300 to 400 hours, sometimes more. The experience gap was widening with every month. German fuel shortages were growing critical. The synthetic fuel plants targeted by the 8th Air Force's bombing campaign were producing less and less. Aircraft were available. The factories were actually producing more fighters in 1944 than in any previous year, partly through dispersal of production to smaller, harder-to-bomb facilities. But the fuel to train the pilots who would fly them, and then to fly them in combat, was running short. The pilots who remained from the early war generation, the veterans with hundreds of aerial victories and the experience that came from flying in combat since Spain or Poland or the Battle of Britain, were becoming rarer with every month. Some had been grounded by high command, considered too valuable as trainers and morale symbols to risk in combat. Others flew on anyway, compelled by a combination of duty and the professional pride of men who had defined themselves entirely through their performance in aerial combat. It was one of these aircraft, flown by one of these pilots or by one of the new men being thrown into the sky half-trained, that Overstreet had chased down across northern France and through the iron lacework of the Eiffel Tower. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. V-Day. Victory in Europe. 8 Air Force bomber crews flew no more missions after April 25, when the last strategic bombing raid of the European campaign struck rail targets in Bavaria. Fighter pilots flew until the last days, covering the final advances of Allied ground forces and occasionally encountering the diminishing remnants of Luftwaffe resistance. By then, the 357th Fighter Group scoreboard, the running tally of aerial victories that every fighter group kept with a combination of official rigor and barely contained competitive pride, stood at 559 confirmed aerial victories. It was one of the highest totals in the 8th Air Force. The group had lost 128 pilots killed or missing in action. The ratio of kills to losses was one of the most favorable in the command. Bill Overstreet survived the war. He returned to Virginia, to the Allegheny Mountains, to civilian life. Like most of the men who flew with the 8th Air Force, he carried the experience quietly. The post-war world had little appetite for the details of what had happened over Europe. America was moving forward, building the suburbs, starting the families, taking the factory jobs and the college degrees that the GI Bill made possible. The men who had flown P-51s over Germany came home and became insurance salesmen and mechanics and farmers and accountants. They married, had children, built lives in the specific American way of the post-war years. What they had done, what they had been capable of, did not translate easily into the language of peacetime. Overstreet lived into old age. He attended 357th Fighter Group reunions in the years before the veterans of that group became too few and too frail to gather. He talked about the war when asked, with the particular combination of precision and reticence that characterized men who had actually been in combat, great detail about the technical aspects, the aircraft performance, the tactical considerations, and a certain quietness about the interior experience of doing what they had done. The story of the Eiffel Tower pursuit circulated in aviation history circles. It appeared in accounts of the 357th Fighter Group's history. It was documented in the records of the 363rd Fighter Squadron. Aviation historians noted it. Warbird enthusiasts, the men and women who spent their weekends at airshows watching restored Mustangs fly, knew the story. It had the quality of a story that sounds too good to be true until you check the sources, at which point it becomes even better. The Eiffel Tower itself, standing today in the same spot where it stood in February 1945, carries no plaque commemorating the engagement. The tower has seen a great deal of history. German soldiers marched beneath it during the occupation. Allied soldiers marched beneath it during the liberation. Tourists have been photographing themselves in front of it since 1889, without interruption for wars, revolutions, or the passage of centuries. But somewhere in its long record of having been present for extraordinary events, it can claim the distinction of having been used as a piece of aerial combat terrain, a three-dimensional obstacle incorporated into a fighter engagement between a P-51 Mustang and a Messerschmitt 109 at low level above the Seine. The Mustang that Overstreet flew that day, a P-51D from the 357th's inventory, wearing the markings of the 363rd Fighter Squadron, was an instrument of the specific moment in history that produced it. The aircraft was the product of British engineering insight, American industrial capacity, Rolls-Royce's metallurgical knowledge, and the organizational ability of the United States Army Air Forces to translate all of those elements into combat power at the end of an 800-mile supply chain from the factories of California and Michigan to the muddy hardstands of Suffolk. It was also the product of the men who maintained it. The crew chiefs and mechanics who worked on those aircraft in the cold of English winters, often without adequate heating, often under the pressure of a mission that had to fly the next morning regardless of what the weather was doing or how long they had been working, were as much a part of the story as the pilots. A fighter pilot is only as good as the aircraft he is given. An aircraft is only as good as the men who keep it flying. The 50 caliber rounds that tore into the German Messerschmitt over Paris had been loaded into the gun trays by an armorer whose name we do not know. The engine that powered Overstreet through the arch of the Eiffel Tower had been run up to full power checks by a crew chief who woke up before dawn to be ready. The fuel that filled the tanks for that mission had been trucked to the hardstand and pumped aboard by men who would never fly in combat and whose contribution to the outcome of the air war over Europe was as real and as essential as anything the pilots did. This is the nature of industrial warfare. It is the aggregation of uncountable individual acts of skill and diligence and endurance, most of them unrecorded, all of them necessary. Bill Overstreet Jr. passed away on February 22, 2013. He was 92 years old. He died in Bedford, Virginia, the same state where he had been born, the same state that sent more men to D-Day per capita than any other state in the Union. The Bedford Boys, the young men of Bedford who landed at Normandy with the 29th Infantry Division on June 6, 1944, had their own memorial in that town. Overstreet was part of the same generation, the same state, the same history. His obituary noted his service with the 357th Fighter Group. It noted his aerial victories. It noted the Eiffel Tower. It was read by the aviation community, filed away, and he joined the long list of men who did extraordinary things and are now remembered by specialists and enthusiasts and the diminishing number of people old enough to have known them. The aircraft he flew are still in the sky. Today, more than 160 airworthy P-51 Mustangs are registered in the United States alone, with perhaps another 40 or 50 flying in other countries. They appear at Oshkosh, at Reno, at airshows from New Zealand to Norway. They carry the paint schemes of the groups that flew them in combat, the checker tails of the Tuskegee Airmen, the red noses of the 4th Fighter Group, the yellow noses of the 361st. Some of those aircraft were built in 1944. They are 80 years old. The Merlin engines that power them, maintained by a small community of specialists who have made careers of keeping these machines alive, turn over with the same sound they made over the skies of Germany, the same sound that North Korean troops learned to fear, the same sound that the Eiffel Tower heard on a February morning in 1945. The sound carries everything with it. The industrial history, the strategic calculations, the training pipeline, the men in the cold of English winters who loaded the guns and ran the engines, the young men from Virginia and Texas and Ohio and Illinois who climbed into narrow cockpits and flew east into the worst air defense system ever assembled. And one specific young man from the Allegheny Mountains who found himself alone over northern France, saw a German aircraft below him, and made a series of decisions that ended with his Mustang threading the arch of the Eiffel Tower at 300 miles per hour. He was doing his job. The job happened to require that. He did it anyway. That is, in some sense, what all of them were doing. The ones we remember and the ones we have forgotten. The pilots and the mechanics and the crew chiefs and the armament men and the meteorology officers and the intelligence officers who ran the briefings and the nurses who treated the wounded and the chaplains who buried the dead. All of them doing their job. The job happened to require everything they had. They did it anyway. If you found the story worth your time, Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every one of these men deserves to be remembered. Every one of these stories deserves to be told. We will keep telling them as long as you keep watching. Leave a comment below letting us know where you are watching from. This community spans the world, from veterans to their grandchildren, and every one of you is part of keeping this history alive.